Colm O'Comartun is the principal at 50 State, one of the nation's most important public affairs and strategy firms for state policy. It's based in DC. Colm used to run the Democratic Governors Association for an extended period of time, and he formed a unique public affairs consultancy with the head, now former head, of the Republican Governors Association. So the two of them now have built this bipartisan state-focused public affairs shop, and I just really appreciate you coming out here to San Diego. So without further ado, let's give Colm a warm welcome to the stage. Thank you.
Thank you all very much for taking some time here. I love to work with DJ. He's one of the smartest, most insightful people that I know, and this has been an amazing year. It's a fun time to be involved in politics, and we do for a living what a lot of people do for fun and entertainment every night as they tune into their cable shows. As he said, I work with the former head of the Republican Governors Association. We represent Fortune 500 companies that do business with state government. I look more like that at the beginning of the election cycle. It's been a crazy year. I kind of felt like that by the end of it. And people ask what happened in this election cycle, so I think we'll dive right in. I was very excited. I had presided over the Democratic gubernatorial losses of 2014 at the end of my cycle, but we went in to that cycle with a similar number of toss-up races as we went into just this year. That year, we lost every one of those 50-50 races. This year, we won every one of our 50-50 races. And we were involved later on in some races that we should never have even been 50-50 in. 49-49 in Georgia for an African-American woman is pretty amazing. So it's worth saying that this was an amazing year for Democrats. We won 53% of voters compared to 45% for the Republicans. And the 8.1% spread between votes for the Democratic candidates and Republican candidates is the largest spread since Watergate. 9.5 million more Americans voted Democrat than voted Republican. And I think it's wonderful, and while I'd like to take some kind of credit on behalf of my professional Democratic colleagues, I'm not sure that Democrats have fully figured out exactly what, but it shouldn't take away the magic sauces, but it shouldn't take away from the fact that it kind of surprises me that people are questioning, was it a wave? I kind of know why, I think, but it was a wave. In 2006 and 2010, the party that won the wave, or that defined that it was a wave, won 57% of the toss-up races. And this year, we won on the House races 57% of those races. You know, 67% of people 18 to 29 voted for the Democratic Party. People who describe themselves as moderates voted for the Democratic Party by 60%. Independents voted Democrat 49% to 37%. And that's very, very important, because if the independents were a party, they'd be the biggest party in America, as more and more people define themselves as independents. Certainly the biggest party in states that people would be surprised to hear, like Massachusetts, where the registered independents far outnumbered Democrats and Republicans. So it was a tremendous year. These numbers are extraordinary. The plus 40 makes it a very, very solid race. And I kind of feel like the reason why people didn't celebrate a little bit more was because of some slightly mismanaged expectations going into election day. And also because in the era of instant gratification, I think we feel that we should know by 10 o'clock how that election went. They say in a presidential debate that the first 2 or 3 minutes defines the narrative that will follow that debate for years. And I think this year, by 10 o'clock, the East Coast was not the coast that delivered us our huge win. And we were also very heavily invested, I think, in the Florida governor's race as Democrats. And it all kind of reminded us a little bit of what we'd experienced as Democrats on election night when Hillary Clinton was on the ballot. And that all of that made us feel a little bit bad. We went to bed. When we were asleep, amazing things happened, delivering a tremendous victory. But by then, President Trump had declared that he was the winner of this year's midterm elections. And so it kind of stuck a little bit. The numbers don't lie, though, and I think it's worthwhile remembering that the numbers mean it was a bigger wave election than those waves in 94, 2006, 2010, 2014, all years that were celebrated as wave elections. Why was it such a monumental election? I think turnout was obviously a huge factor. If those Democrats that turned out had not been matched by the huge amount of Republicans that turned out, it would have been an unbelievable year for Democrats, and I will give Trump some credit for that. I'm not sure it all turned on the Kavanaugh hearings, but certainly around that time, Republicans came home, and the president, by injecting a tremendous amount of high-profile issues to inspire his Republican voters to come out, including the invasion from the South, which seems to have faded in intensity since the election has ended. But he drew out a lot of voters that traditionally don't vote. Since this little chart was done, I believe we've hit 49%, which makes it the biggest turnout in a midterm election in 100 years since 2014. And we have to ask ourselves why. And I think we all know that the voters have become extremely angry, and anger drives turnout, which is why more and more you see people inject some divisiveness into the debate, because it does drive out voters. Voters who are complacent or happy or content just don't vote in the same numbers. And they're mad, and they're somewhat legitimately mad, because there's been a lot of change in the last few years. And those changes have affected folks in the areas that are facing economic challenges, but they are demographic changes, they are geographic changes, and more people feel the institutions no longer serve the giant challenges that face them economically, politically. And that's why we saw a rejection by the Democratic candidate, but also a rejection of the Republican establishment candidates by those voters. And so they voted for this man. And this man has driven turnout tremendously by seizing the narrative and making every conversation about him to a greater extent than any politician, maybe since Nixon and Watergate. That has pitfalls, and it has opportunity. More opportunity for him, and I would suggest more pitfalls for his party. One of the symptoms of change is, for this year, only 41 US senators in the next Congress will have served prior to 2010. Only 152 members of the House of Representatives will have served prior to 2010. And this turnover is going to continue into 2020, when 12 of the 34 senators up for re-election will be 70 years or more. So generational change is a huge factor in that. You know, Trump carried 84% of counties in the United States. 84% of counties in the United States voted Republican this time. But he's been underwater every day since his election, which is very unusual. It all goes back to the story of these elections, which is a new drive, new enthusiasm among voters that haven't voted in these numbers before. You know, he's underwater 45, 54. Today, he went down to 38, 36, which means on average for the last 2 years, his approval number's been 40. And when you've got the strongly disapprove at 46% versus the strongly approve at 31%, you get the midterm result that we got. And if you think that it was a referendum on Congress, which has had painfully low approval numbers for the last few years, 26% of people in the midterms came out to support President Trump. 38% came out to oppose President Trump. So, to a large extent, it was a referendum on the president. And we know that whenever the president's approval numbers drop below 50%, it leads to a loss of a lot of House seats. The only reason that Obama in 2014 didn't lose more House seats was that he'd lost so many House seats in the midterms before. Under the Obama 8 years, we lost 1,000 seats nationally. I had the honor of presiding over a large amount of those in governors in the 4 years that I was at the DGA. Here's what happened on election day. Who voted and who voted for Republican and who voted for Democrats. This chart is useful because it just shows in the blue lines the individual sectors that are driving some of the changes that we're seeing. Obviously, we know that more males vote Republican than females, but the gender gap, women voted Democratic by 59 to 40. Men split 47 to 51 for Republicans. That 23% gender gap is the biggest in the national House vote since 1982. So Democrats are winning 59% of the group of people that make up 52% of the electorate. There's some good numbers. More women than ever were nominated and elected, and we're going to see, 113 women plus voted into the Congress this time. But they're also driving the conversation, and I actually posit that they're pulling some of the male voters away from the Republican Party that traditionally have voted for the Republican Party. Almost every age group here voted over 50% for Democrat in this election. The 50 to 64 age group tied 49 for Democrats, 49 for Republicans. And 53% of 65-year-old plus women voted Democrat. We'll be looking in a minute at some real steps back that the Republican Party is making, but these Asian, Latino, and African American numbers are hugely important because smart heads in the Republican Party, Mitt Romney and George Bush, had identified these growing areas as areas that Republicans could and should win over if they were going to prosper in the future. And we saw in California that Latinos particularly were inclined to be open to a conversation with Republicans until faced with some anti-Hispanic legislation, and now we have a lot of anti-Hispanic rhetoric that's driving them out of the party. The post-grad, college grad, and some college voters, that's a lot of voters to lose. And as we can see from this quite complex chart, but basically if you look over to the right, it's Republicans in 2014, Democrat-Republican votes in 2014, beside it 2018. You'll see that the Republicans have lost in every one of these categories. The Republicans are taking a step back from the midterms just 4 years ago, even among men, which is where we just feel like they're very, very dominant. I think the most important number here is in the 2018 total column, where you see that's where you see the women are 52% of the electorate to 48% of males. But you also see that the 65 plus group makes up 26% of the electorate. And what you see that I think is the alarming number, so compared to the 13% for 18 to 29. So what we do know is that the 18 to 29-year-olds are voting for Democrats at 67% rate. There's no way these younger Democratic voters are able to outweigh the over 65 voters. But what is important to remember is that people tend to continue to vote for the rest of their life for the party that they voted for the first time they voted. So winning people at the early stage of their voting career is very helpful and very useful. What's really important here, and that's alarming, I think, for the Republican Party, is that in 1990, white voters made up 91% of the electorate. And in this chart right here, this year, they're now 28% of the electorate. Sorry, non-whites are 28% of the electorate. 72% are white. By 2040, whites will not be a majority in this country. And so you have, so really what I'm saying is that a lot of these strategies and what we experience in the news every day, it actually works for Donald Trump. But I think we are building some long-term challenges for the Republican Party, and these midterms are a good example, good opportunity for us to unpack that and analyze it. You know, Latinos are up from 8% to 11% of voters. There's a kind of a trope that Latinos don't vote. And I think they're starting to become more engaged, and they're starting to become a much more engaged part of the electorate. Remember, Latinos the Hispanic population in the United States is much younger than the white population of the United States. So they're naturally going to vote less because younger people vote less than older people. But that will turn and change. To actively alienate that huge group of voters it seems to me to be, in this I stand shoulder to shoulder with George W. Bush, would seem to be short-term and foolish. Bush, the blue bar in the middle is George Bush's share of these electoral groups, 48% of women, 11% of African Americans, 44% of Latinos, 43% of Asians. I mean, the reality is that Asians were drifting to become a more Republican ethnic group in the United States until Donald Trump got elected. And as we know from Texas, although Hispanic voters can be very, very different from each other in different parts of the country, but we do know that after 3 generations, Hispanic and virtually every ethnic group in the United States except Jewish voters become extremely mainstream and start to split their vote in proportion to the general population, unless you alienate that group, which seems to be happening right now. The bedrock of the Republican Party's vote has always been suburban voters. Actually, college-educated suburban voters used to be the bedrock of the Republican Party. White-collar poor white people were Democrats. They were unionized, industrial Democrats. And now we see Democrats are winning suburban areas by 53% to 45%. And that suburban area is where 44% of the population lives. Trump is managing to succeed personally by really maximizing turnout from this small town rural group who are now making up 35% of the midterm electorate. But if I was to go into the CEO of a corporation and say, boss, here's the latest market analysis, we're losing African Americans, Hispanics, women, young people, anybody under 65, but we are doing great with aging rural voters or consumers. I think I'd be fired in a heartbeat unless I was selling Depends. The challenge here is that long-term Democrats are dominating on the coasts. It's going to be great in the House. I think it's going to work if we can actually find a message that we can present to these people who are naturally inclined to vote for us. Population's moving to the coast. It's growing there. The Senate will more and more present a challenge for Democrats as white rural voters become concentrated in states where they're losing some of their younger population, and we will now have 2 senators from California, 2 senators from New York, 2 senators from Wyoming, from South Dakota, from North Dakota, which I think could present a long-term constitutional challenge if we're not aware of it. The great news here for everybody in this room is that healthcare dominated the conversation this year. I think it was with some relief that Democrats avoided being distracted and playing on the field that the president likes to play on. The president knew that if the conversation is about immigration, that he would win those people that cared about that issue by 75% to 23%. That's why we had the invasion. That's why we had troops mobilized for the first time in peacetime in the United States in 100 years to go down to the border. But Democrats stuck to their message pretty well. And we knew that if healthcare was the issue on the mind of the voter, that Democrats could win that group 75-23. The economy we'll get to in a second. Gun policy, only 10% of people made that their number one issue. But when they did, I think long term we'll see that arise as more and more important issue for Democrats. It's the economy, stupid, unless the economy is doing great. And then it's not about the economy, because lots of people feel like, will acknowledge that the economy is good. And less of them, I think worryingly for Republicans, feel that their personal economy is doing great. In fact, 63% of people feel like they're just holding steady in a time of economic expansion and boom because of the decoupling of wages from growth, from productivity. It's going to be a long-term problem if we don't deal with it. But didn't stop Democrats picking up those seats. So what did we do this time to make it work? Well, really, a lot of it came down to these people who we've seen before. You've seen those before with their pink hats, women. Women, the face of the resistance is actually a 50-year-old librarian woman. It's not a 23-year-old protester on the streets at the gates. They are the shepherds of the resistance. College moms are the new soccer moms. And they are women in the suburbs who I feel are pulling over their college-educated husbands, who are maybe feeling that it's just not the place to be voting for the Trump Republican Party. What else we did? We actually got the finances right for the first time. Democrats weren't outspent by, for the first time in this chart, we just see that just for 2018, Democrats held their pace. They actually had a little bit more money than Republicans, and then we don't quite know what's in that third party group there in the green, but we can tell it's growing, and soon, if we don't do something about it, it will be the only color on that chart, and we won't know where the money's coming from and who the money's going to. That's a different conversation. For now, we'll celebrate on the Democratic side that Senate Democrats outpace Senate Republicans on out-of-state fundraising. This is the internet. This is individuals in South Dakota sending their money to people in Georgia, people in Florida. That was a huge part of Democrats' ability to compete this year. And then what Democrats have done is actually allow the party to represent the face of America. Two high-profile Democratic primary races that a lot of people talked about this year were in New York, where Joe Crowley lost a primary, and in Massachusetts, where Congressman Capuano lost a primary. They lost them not on the issues. In fact, Capuano's opponent said she thought that his votes in Congress were perfectly fine. She supported every one of them. But you got to look like your constituents at a certain point. There's generational change. And then Capuano and Crowley represented districts that used to be all Irish and Italian. And now they're not. And change has come to them. And we've seen just a remarkable array of diversity among Democrats elected. And that's a good thing to bind the elected to their voters. Candidates matter. We had good candidates this year. We had good candidates in the races that we won, and they had good candidates in the races that they won. They just won less of them. But Larry Hogan and Governor Baker in Massachusetts are excellent candidates, and they did well. State elections, just very quickly now, we're hitting the last part of this race to the finish here. The 2019 governor's map will show 23 governors on the Democratic side to 27. That's a net pickup of 7. What's interesting about this map, I think, is that we've got more blue states in the middle. We've got Colorado. We've added New Mexico and Kansas to that kind of just above Texas. And if we could just bridge the gap to Governor Bullock up there in Montana, we'd build a wall between the East and West, and that's a really good sign. We've got a solid West Coast. The East Coast not looking as solid, but we certainly did well in the Midwest. That was important to dispel our sense that we could no longer win in the Midwest. We won in Minnesota, we won in Wisconsin, and in Michigan, I thought we scored a very, very good victory. We'll come back to this later, but remember, Pennsylvania, we won this year. Michigan, we won this year. Wisconsin, we won this year. 3 states that together allowed President Trump to win that presidential election. Yep, we flipped these 7 states. They're in places that we want and at the time that we really want them. Because the reason why, even though we won 9.5 million more Democratic voters, but we didn't win a majority of the available seats in Congress. We won a majority. We didn't win anything near what 9.5 million should have gotten you, is because of our own friend gerrymander. And those gerrymandering moves were made as a result of the 2010 census. The 2020 census will decide the next 10 years, and that federal gerrymandering is mirrored in state elections. And so it's very important that we have governors in these states that are important to us. Democrats won 7 out of the 10 states that they really wanted to win in a redistricting fight. The other thing is, when the governor and the state house are aligned, you see much more dramatic change in legislation. My best example on this is that you'll see that Governor Hickenlooper in Colorado was deemed a very moderate governor. I think he is a very moderate governor. Governor Polis, incoming governor of Colorado, I think is similarly moderate, to be honest. Even though he's from Boulder and he's the first gay elected governor in America. He was the first person who was openly gay while they were elected governor, which is different. Governor McGreevey of New Jersey, I think, was the first. So he is going to have legislation pushed on him constantly by a Democratic House and Senate. He will either lose credibility and lose votes from his own party and end up like Governor Malloy, the least popular governor in America, by standing up to your legislature, or he will look like a very, very liberal governor, much more liberal than his predecessor. And so these what we call trifectas, I think are very important in the sort of legislation that gets done. As you see, if we just do that, we have a lot more trifectas. We should expect to see a lot more progressive legislation in those states. Supermajorities, we have one in California now. We will also see, we either flipped away from the Republican supermajorities, as in North Carolina, which was stopping the governor of North Carolina, Democratic governor, from accomplishing anything. Now they've lost their Republican supermajorities, and he will now be able to be a much more functional governor. So we saw a number of gains in that area. Healthcare. The views of the Affordable Care Act were more good news for Democrats and for people in this room this year, I thought. We should be aware that even though a majority of people, the biggest group of people asked about their views of the Affordable Care Act want to expand the Affordable Care Act, and 47% want to leave the law as it is or expand it. 52% are open to repealing parts of the law. We don't quite know where they're coming from right now, but we should be listening and talking to those people and educating as much as we can, those of us who care about healthcare. Great news on people who care about Medicaid. People in Idaho, Nebraska, and Utah, by popular ballot initiative, voted to expand Medicaid. And so if we look at the Medicaid expansion map after the midterms, it's looking very blue right across the country. I think Medicaid is one of those things like gay marriage that soon is going to be, Medicaid expansion is soon going to be an accepted issue in state after state. And popular initiatives apply a lot of pressure to elected representatives in other states to feel like it's inevitable. You might as well be in front of the wave, a swamp by the wave. It's really a matter of the Deep South and a number of outliers who I think are resisting at this point. What does it all mean? I think that we've come to a point where there is a greater acceptance that that the electeds should look a little bit more like the elected. The electeds should look more like the voters. The voters say it's important to elect racial and ethnic minorities by 72% to 24%, and the importance of voting for women, 78 to 20%. I think you're going to see a lot more activism. The ballot initiative process is gaining ground across the country. Thanks, California, for exporting that expensive proposition to everybody else. It is right now being used mainly for progressive issues. And those who pay attention to, again, that gay marriage issue was an interesting example of how if you can build enough momentum to ballot initiatives state by state, eventually you can get a federal solution to that patchwork issue. I think the $15 minimum wage in 10 years will have accomplished the same thing. Ballot initiatives initially, as we see, there were a number of wage-related issues on the ballot. I think that will become a drumbeat. States are going to do more because they feel like the executive on issues that democratic states care about: drug prices, protecting the Affordable Care Act, privacy. Actually, I think that criminal justice, trade, infrastructure, chip, and opioids are probably actually going to get a good hearing in a new split Congress. But people have lost a little faith in the institutions in Washington to get things done, and they are, I think, you'll see more of a greater alignment between activists and NGOs to accomplish that. And then finally, this year's presidential election is already upon us. You all should be ready to take a brief respite now, where you're going to look at car ads and a variety of those ads that you fell in love with when you were a kid, because soon the airwaves will again be clogged with those $2 billion worth of ads that are coming our way. The presidential election is going to have a Democratic primary that will have a tremendous amount of energy on the left. It'll surface a lot of issues that are pretty progressive, especially because this year Democrats will have a long primary season with no winner-take-all states, no superdelegates, so that every vote is to fight for along the way to the convention. And California has been moving up the schedule, which gives people who may struggle in the Iowas and New Hampshires incentive to hang on to California if they think that their progressive agenda is going to get a better hearing there. And then across the country, some things have changed. Again, the Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania all elected Democratic governors this year, 3 important states for the Republicans last time. And in Florida, a popular initiative, a ballot initiative, allowed 1.5 million people with a felony to vote in the upcoming presidential election, which is amazing when you consider how slim the margins have been year after year in Florida, both in the governor, Senate, and presidential elections. So I know I can't wait for the presidential election to start, because it seems like forever ago that we were talking about politics and elections. And I know that soon those emails asking for your money will be arriving in your inboxes. So thank you for your time here today.
Thank you, Colm. I appreciate it. I want to make sure people can ask questions if you'd like. If anyone has a question, go ahead and raise your hand. We'll get you a microphone. Otherwise, I'll just ping them at you. Right up here, do we have one handy? Thanks, Sujin. Make sure that's on, too. I know I just sprung this on everybody.
So let me put together the fact that the occupant of the White House did not win a majority of votes, popular votes, last time, and then add that to what you saw on this election day. As a professional in the field, tell us what you think the implications are for the presidential race next time.
The thing to keep in mind about the presidential race is that the evidence of the past is that the midterms are not a guide or an indicator as to how the presidential election is going to go. President Obama got shellacked in both of his midterms and yet easily won re-election the following year. I think the thing for us to watch is what impact these changes that the Democratic Party has instituted in the process to pick its nominee will be, and who that nominee will be. You need a good candidate to beat Donald Trump, who's an amazing communicator and has the ability to turn out voters that nobody else seems to be able to harness, that he stokes anger and he's able to communicate with people who feel like he's the only one who represents their interests. So I do think it'll depend on the candidate.
And that's really something you hammered home here and in our previous conversations, which is just because something might be really good for Trump or Obama does not mean anything for the Democratic Party or the Republican Party, right? I mean, the Democratic Party got eviscerated under Obama.
Barack Obama was somewhat of a disaster for Democratic candidates across the country. In our case, I mean, we actually know what the problems were. The Affordable Care Act was deeply unpopular, and we felt that the president didn't do a good enough job selling it because he had such faith in the content. And he would tell us in the ranks of governors, he would say, but the public likes all of the components. The public likes what the hell do you call it? They don't, I was going to say the individual mandate. They don't like that.
Being able to access your kids on your insurance till 26.
Hugely popular. So the president, Axelrod, came to the Democratic governors meeting and he said to 28 Democratic governors, he said, we have poll tested this and we know that this is really popular, this is really popular, and this is really popular. And they didn't do enough to insulate those governors from the consequences of a campaign to vilify something that's complicated. Healthcare is complicated. And that's where the president does an amazing job of simplifying things and piling on. But it'll work for him, but we're seeing it's creating real problems for the other people, which means that moderate Republicans are losing. So we do know that the Senate is going to be a more conservative place, or the Republicans in the Senate will be more conservative. We know the House is going to be a little more young and a little more progressive. And so we'll see if the president is going to be handed some issues by the Democrats in the House to run against. If he's able to attach Nancy Pelosi to some issues that he can maybe amplify or mischaracterize because she has to enable some legislation to come to the floor to keep her progressive wing happy, then that will play into his hands. So I have faith that Nancy, who I have a lot of faith in, Baltimore, I have faith that Nancy will try and mitigate the impact of that, but it's a danger.
Can I just follow up a little quickly? How does Nancy Pelosi play outside of California?
You know, I think there's two things. Republicans will vilify Republicans. Every party will vilify whoever that person is. It doesn't really matter. Nancy is a useful trope for them. The vast majority of people don't really have much of an opinion on, except for a lot of political insiders. I think, though, in Democratic circles, the lack of a spokesperson for the party means there's even more pressure on those that are there to represent the party. And I think that can be challenging when, back to my point of, do you look like the energetic wing of the party? Today, they voted on the leadership of the Democratic Party, which was Clyburn and Steny, the Great Dane, and Nancy. I mean, that's not necessarily the face of the progressive democratic future of the Democratic Party. And therefore, I think that does create some problems beyond just the insiders. But fundamentally, most people don't have much of an opinion.
Steny Hoyer's nickname is the Great Dane.
Yeah, the Great Dane.
Yikes.
Another Marylander.
Just to clarify something politically and then a healthcare question. So you mentioned Governor-elect Polis. Actually, Jared grew up here in San Diego, and he cut his teeth politically at a time when it was much more where Democrats really had to appeal to Republicans. So I'll be interested to see if he relies upon and goes back to those roots and utilizes those as being governor in Colorado. And my healthcare question is, if it's inevitable that other states that are Republican or red states are going to have to do some type of Medicaid expansion, what would that look like? What's the message look like? Or what's the program look like? Could it be something like what the Republican legislature did in cutting a deal with Governor Bullock of Montana?
Yes. So we saw that the Republican legislatures with the Democratic governor that have moved ahead, the deal that they have struck was always the fig leaf of work requirements. Indiana has become a model obviously, because Pence was looked to on the Medicaid expansion issue for Republican states that reluctantly were going to expand Medicaid, and so they latched on to the work requirements and a number of other drug testing or a number of other requirements that allowed Republicans to feel like they had gotten concessions in the area. We saw the model that Bullock did in Montana is modeled on one that was done in Arkansas first. And that is the most problematic of those solutions. I kind of feel with some optimism that the work requirements piece will satisfy the need. And, our experience in Indiana was that really wasn't enforced in a way that had a detrimental effect on recipients. It could be in some states, but it wasn't there. And it's preferable to just using Medicaid dollars to buy insurance on the open market, which is kind of the model that they used in Montana. What's interesting is on that map, Montana had a ballot initiative to continue to fund Medicaid expansion by raising the cigarette tax by $2 a pack. That was rejected by the voters, which led some analysts to say they thought that Montana was a state that was going to retract, if that's the opposite, retreat Medicaid. But in reality, all that will happen will be that the legislature will agree to fund it because the cost is only like, I said to people, my God, you're telling me that your whole Medicaid expansion for the state only costs the $2 on the pack of cigarettes, how much is it? And they said it's $40 million. I'm like, that doesn't sound like much. I'm like, yeah, because the feds pay the vast majority of the money. So they're not going to hand the feds back all of the Medicaid money that they currently get for their expanded Medicaid. Instead, the legislature is going to say, we'll give you the $40 million in exchange for work requirements, drug tests, these other things that make it look like we've really stuck it to you.
I want to make sure we're out of time. I want to make sure people have a chance to throw more questions at you. Are you going to stay around for our cocktail hour a little bit?
Sure.
I appreciate it. Let me ask you a couple other quick questions. You're a Martin O'Malley guy. He ran for president. People forget he ran for president in the primary in 2016 against Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton. Is he going to run for president in 2020?
I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if everybody. I expect you to run for president in 2020. I think we're up to 30 people who are not ruling it out, which is probably wise at this point.
I think we've talked about this before. When was the last time the Democratic Party nominated a straight white man for president?
Yeah.
It's 2004.
Yeah.
John Kerry, 14 years ago. Is it likely that the Democratic Party will ever nominate a straight white man again in our lifetimes?
I think that there is a good chance, that a Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, who is beloved outside of California. I don't know how she's perceived in California, but outside of California, a lot of people like her. A Joe Biden, Kamala Harris ticket where there's the quiet assumption that Joe won't run for a second term and that vice president will assume the slot or be the leading nominee in a new process. I think that could get Joe into the job.
Interesting.
I don't know the answer to that, but
Colm O'Comartun, thank you very much for making time coming all the way out for DC. Let's give him a round of applause.